No one dared to approach the millionaire until the maid's daughter wiped away his tears. Nathaniel Cross, 42 years old, was the CEO of one of the most powerful financial investment firms in New York. He disliked familiarity, distrusted relationships that served no purpose, and had little tolerance for meaningless conversation. In his world, everything had to serve a function, and emotions to him were the most dangerous luxury of all. Nathaniel Cross's penthouse sat at the very top of a luxury building overlooking Central Park South. It was designed to impress, and it succeeded flawlessly. But impression was not the same as warmth. The entire space was wrapped in cold tones: gray, black, white. Marble floors reflected the lights like mirrors. Abstract paintings hung on the walls, each worth enough to buy several modest apartments, yet none carried the imprint of human emotion. Everything was perfect, and because of that, everything felt lifeless. Nathaniel rarely noticed his home. To him, it was simply a place to sleep, change clothes, and prepare for the next workday. There were no family photos, no souvenirs, nothing that suggested anyone had ever lived there besides himself. The only constant presence in the penthouse was Mrs. Whitmore, a housekeeper in her early 60s. She had worked for Nathaniel for nearly 10 years and knew every habit, every rule, every boundary he maintained. But their relationship never went beyond necessity. "Everything is ready, sir," she said every morning, precisely at 7. Nathaniel responded with a slight nod. Mrs. Whitmore no longer expected words. Over the years, she had learned that his silence was not disrespect. It was a wall, a tall, solid wall with no door. Nathaniel's breakfast never changed: black coffee with no sugar, lightly toasted bread, a glass of cold juice. He ate alone, gazing at the city through thick glass, while millions of people below rushed through their lives. Elena Morales stood in front of the heavy metal door of the penthouse, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had spent years cleaning wealthy homes, but none had ever made her heart race like this one. Not because of the luxury, but because of the man who lived inside. Elena had heard enough rumors about Nathaniel Cross: cold, demanding, unforgiving. People said a single mistake could cost someone their job instantly. Still, she was here because she had no other choice. When the door opened, Elena lowered her head instinctively. Mrs. Whitmore's voice followed, calm and professional. She led Elena inside, briefly explaining the work schedule, the areas that needed cleaning, and emphasizing one thing above all else. "Mr. Cross does not like to be disturbed." Elena nodded repeatedly. She was used to strict rules, but today there was something weighing on her far more heavily. She took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "Ma'am, may I ask for one thing?" Mrs. Whitmore looked at her, her expression firm but not unkind. "Elena, my daughter is 5 years old," she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly. "I have no one to watch her. If possible, I'd like to bring her with me. She's very quiet, very well behaved. She won't disturb anyone." The request had never existed in the rulebook of this house. Mrs. Whitmore fell silent for a few seconds, then stepped into Nathaniel's glass-walled office. Elena waited outside, her heart pounding violently. She had already prepared herself for a cold refusal. When Mrs. Whitmore returned, she spoke slowly. "Mr. Cross agrees, but there is one condition." Elena held her breath. "The child must remain absolutely quiet. No running, no talking, no interruptions to his work." Elena nodded again and again, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Yes, ma'am, I promise." "Work must follow a strict order," she said curtly. "Start with the main living area. Only when everything there is flawless may you move on to the dining space and the kitchen. Auxiliary rooms come last. The upper floor. Leave it alone." They continued through the dining area, then the kitchen, then the smaller sitting room further inside. Every door that opened revealed a space so clean it made Elena feel as though she were stepping into places that did not need to be cleaned, only preserved. As they neared the staircase leading to the private quarters, Mrs. Whitmore slowed her pace. She did not turn around, but her voice dropped to a different register. During the daytime, the upper floor does not exist to you. Elena understood before the sentence was finished. No noise, no questions, and absolutely no going upstairs unless you are called. A silence stretched for several seconds, long enough for Elena to feel the weight of that rule settle in. Mrs. Whitmore finally turned back, her gaze firm but not cold. "If Mr. Cross leaves his study," she continued, "you simply stop. No greeting, no explanation. Standing still is enough." Elena nodded, not out of fear but because she understood. In this place, the safest form of existence was knowing when to be silent. Lily Morales stepped into the penthouse, holding tightly onto her mother's hand, her small fingers slightly cold with nervousness. She had never seen a place so vast and so quiet. Everything gleamed under the lights, yet nothing felt warm or welcoming like the home she knew. Elena bent down and whispered in her daughter's ear. "Remember what I told you," she said softly. "You must stay very quiet. This place isn't like our home." Lily nodded seriously, like a tiny adult. Her wide eyes took in every detail around her with cautious curiosity. She didn't run. She didn't touch anything. She simply stood still, listening to the heavy silence that filled the space. In Lily's arms was an old cloth doll, its yarn hair worn thin, one button eye slightly loose. It was her most precious possession. She held it close to her chest, like a small shield protecting her from this unfamiliar world. As Elena began cleaning, Lily was told to sit in a corner of the living room near the tall bookshelf. She obeyed without question. There were no electronic games, no screens, no music, just her doll and a quiet imagination. Lily whispered to her doll, her voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the air. She gave it a name, told it small stories about yesterday, about the long bus ride, about how tired her mother had been. The first 2 weeks passed with an almost flawless smoothness. Everything in the penthouse operated in perfect rhythm, nothing excessive, nothing out of place. Much like the financial markets Nathaniel Cross commanded each day. Elena blended into that rhythm naturally, without needing reminders, without corrections. She worked quietly, but never carelessly. Every surface was treated with deliberation, every object returned to its precise position as if it had never been touched at all. The vacuum lines on the carpet always ran parallel, perfectly aligned, leaving no trace of haste. This was not innate perfectionism. It was the habit of someone long accustomed to not being allowed to make mistakes. Mrs. Whitmore noticed it from the very first days. She did not offer much praise, but one morning, standing at a distance, she spoke softly, her voice low enough not to disturb the silence. "You understand this house." That was all. Yet to Elena it was rare recognition. More importantly, throughout those 2 weeks, not a single message came down from the upper floor. No requests, no complaints. To those who had worked in this penthouse for years, that silence carried a meaning clearer than any praise. Since Elena Morales and the child appeared, the apartment no longer carried the air of a place left untouched. There was no loud noise, no obvious disruption, only very small changes, slipping quietly between the cold marble and the light-reflecting glass surfaces. Nathaniel still bent over his screen, the numbers moving in steady patterns. Yet at times he realized he had been rereading the same line of a report for far too long. There were sounds, very faint ones, not loud enough to break the silence, but enough to exist within it. "Mom, can I hold this cloth for you?" A child's voice rose once, thin as a strand of thread. Elena did not answer immediately. There were soft footsteps, then her voice followed, low and unhurried, as though she were teaching something important. "You just need to sit there. Watching is already helping me." A brief pause. Then the barely audible scrape of a chair, carefully controlled. "Tonight, when we get home," Elena continued, "we'll work together." There was no specific promise, no reward mentioned, just a simple plan, spoken as if it were self-evident. Nathaniel stopped moving his hand. They were ordinary words, too ordinary. Yet in a space where he had grown accustomed to decisive commands and clipped replies, those sounds carried a strangely misplaced feeling. It happened on a morning that seemed completely ordinary. Nathaniel Cross stepped out of his glass-walled office to get a glass of water. It was a rare habit. He usually had everything prepared for him. But that day, for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to walk out himself. As he passed through the living room, Nathaniel slowed down. Lily was standing in front of the massive aquarium that covered an entire wall. She stood on her tiptoes, her small hands resting against the thick glass, her eyes glowing with wonder. Colorful tropical fish glided between artificial coral reefs, the lights above making them shimmer like living gemstones. "So pretty," Lily whispered, forgetting all the rules about silence. She smiled softly as a golden fish swam close. "Hello," she said quietly. "Do you like living here?" Nathaniel froze. He had never looked at his aquarium that way. To him, it had always been just another expensive object, part of a home designed to display status. But through the eyes of a 5-year-old girl, it became a living world, pure, untouched by money or power. And then a buried memory stirred. The image of young Nathaniel appeared, standing in front of a small fish shop in a Brooklyn suburb, his nose nearly pressed against the glass, mesmerized by the colorful fish inside. Beside him stood his father, thin and tired, still wearing his factory uniform after a long shift. One day, his father had said, his voice weary but warm, "When you grow up and work hard, you'll be able to buy anything you want." His father never lived long enough to see that day. He died of a heart attack while Nathaniel was still in college, leaving behind an unfulfilled promise and a hollow space that was never filled. Nathaniel had buried that memory deep because it carried a vulnerability he refused to keep. But now, standing behind a child talking to fish, all his defenses felt fragile. Nathaniel realized it had been a long time since he had stopped to truly see something beautiful. He only saw its price, its function, the advantage it provided. Lily, however, saw only life. The moment passed, brief but profound, and though Nathaniel didn't yet know it, that moment had quietly cracked the emotional wall he had spent his entire life building. That afternoon, everything seemed to return to Nathaniel Cross's familiar rhythm. He sat behind his desk, surrounded by thick financial reports, lifeless numbers moving steadily across his screens. Beyond the reinforced glass, New York City continued its relentless motion. Everything appeared to be under his control, until his phone vibrated. Nathaniel glanced at the screen. Dr. Andrew Cole, his cardiologist of many years. This call wasn't scheduled. "Andrew," Nathaniel said calmly, "I'm busy. If this is about routine test results, send me an email." There was silence on the other end, a pause long enough to make Nathaniel frown. "Nathaniel," the doctor's voice lowered, "I need to speak with you right now." A cold sensation ran down Nathaniel's spine. "I don't have time for mysteries," Nathaniel replied, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "Be direct." Another pause. Then the doctor spoke, slowly, clearly, without avoidance. "Your heart is failing. The tests show advanced dilated heart failure. Your heart is functioning at about 20%. Nathaniel said nothing. He stared at the glass wall in front of him, seeing his own reflection, a man in a flawless suit, expression controlled. Inside, everything began to fracture. "Andrew," he said, his voice rougher now, "I need solutions, medication, surgery. I don't care about details." The doctor's voice grew heavy. "We can manage symptoms with medication for some time, but long-term, the only real option is a heart transplant." One word, transplant. Nathaniel tightened his grip on the phone. "And if there's no transplant?" he asked, though he already knew. "We're talking months," the doctor said plainly, "not years." There was no thunder, no dramatic sound, only silence flooding the room like rising water. Nathaniel ended the call. His hands began to tremble, slightly, uncontrollably. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Cross, the man who controlled billions, realized there was something he could not control. Time. Everything he had once sacrificed for his work suddenly came back with painful clarity. The relationships left behind, the calls never returned, the promises of later that had never been given a chance to become real. He rose to his feet and stepped out of the office like a man who had lost his bearings. The long corridor suddenly felt unfamiliar. The luxurious penthouse now resembled a vast golden cage. And then, when the fear swelled beyond his ability to contain it, Nathaniel Cross broke down in tears. Not loud sobs, but silent tears, falling from a man who had never allowed himself to be weak. And then he saw Lily. She stood still in the middle of the hallway, so small she nearly blended into the wall behind her. There was no doll in her hands, no Elena at her side, only clear, wide eyes watching him without a trace of avoidance. Nathaniel stopped. Lily did not ask. She did not step back. She moved toward him very slowly, as if approaching something fragile. Each step was light, careful, making no sound. Then, with a gesture so natural it made adults forget they had ever been capable of such a thing, she lifted her hand. Her small, warm palm touched his tear-streaked cheek. Tiny fingers gently brushed away a lingering drop, the movement clumsy, yet full of patience. Nathaniel did not move. There were no words of comfort, no questions, only a pure presence without demand, without judgment, a kind of tenderness he could no longer remember the last time he had received. "Are you sad?" the little girl asked, very softly, as if afraid of breaking the air around them. The question had not yet reached its answer when a hurried voice came from the kitchen. "Lily, stop right there." Elena appeared, her hands still wet from washing dishes. When she saw the scene before her, she froze. The color drained from her face. Her daughter was standing far too close to the man everyone in this building had learned to walk around. And he, the man who had never allowed anyone to see him weaken, was bent slightly forward, his eyes red, his vulnerability completely unhidden. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cross," Elena said quickly, her voice trembling. She doesn't understand." She reached out to pull Lily away. But Nathaniel raised his hand. Just a simple gesture, yet it was enough to make Elena stop short. "It's all right," he said. His voice was hoarse but steady. "She didn't do anything wrong." Lily turned to look at her mother, very serious. "He looks like you do when you cry," she said. "I just did what I always do with you." That simple sentence made something inside Nathaniel's chest loosen, not pain, but a long empty space finally being touched. He lowered himself, kneeling until he was level with Lily. The movement was so natural that even he was surprised. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I forgot that it was allowed." It was the first time in many years that Nathaniel Cross had said thank you without any condition or expectation attached. Mrs. Whitmore appeared at the far end of the hallway, a silver tray trembling slightly in her hands. She stopped when she took in the scene before her, her employer on the stone floor, speaking to a child, his eyes stripped of their usual defenses. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked cautiously. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I just need a little time," he replied. Lily tugged gently at the hem of his jacket, very polite. "My mom says that when you're sad, you should talk to someone who's willing to listen," she said. "If you want, I can sit and listen." Nathaniel smiled faintly, a sad smile, but a real one. "What do you usually talk about?" he asked. "About the fish in your house," Lily answered at once. "About my doll, and about the stories Mom tells me before I go to sleep." Elena stood there, witnessing something she had never thought possible. The coldest man she had ever met was listening to her daughter as if it were the most important thing in his day. "If you need us to leave early," she began. Nathaniel shook his head. "I'd like you both to stay a little longer," he said, "if you don't mind." Not an order, just an invitation. Lily let out a small, delighted squeal and ran off to fetch her old cloth doll. She placed it into Nathaniel's hands, carefully, as if passing on a secret. "It's a bit old," Lily said, "but it always listens when I tell stories." Nathaniel held the doll with both hands, slowly, as though afraid of hurting something fragile. "It's very beautiful," he said. And this time there was no trace of formality in his voice. After a long silence, Mrs. Whitmore spoke. "Sir, you haven't had anything since this morning. May I prepare some tea?" Nathaniel nodded. "Thank you." Lily chimed in, naturally. "When my mom is sad, she makes chamomile tea. It's easier to breathe after." Nathaniel looked at the little girl for a moment, then said softly, "Then, chamomile tea." Steam rose gently from the teacups on the glass table in the living room. The warmth of the tea slowly softened the remaining tension in the air. Nathaniel Cross sat on the sofa, his hands resting on his knees, his posture slightly awkward, like a man accustomed to standing above others, now unsure how to sit among them. Lily sat across from him, her legs swinging lightly. Her old cloth doll rested securely in her arms again. Elena sat beside her daughter, her back straight, but the fear in her eyes had faded. Mrs. Whitmore placed the tray down and sat nearby, observing quietly. Lily took a small sip of tea, blowing gently as she had been taught. "Do you live alone?" she asked naturally. There was no rudeness in her curiosity, only simple concern. Nathaniel was silent for a moment. "Yes," he replied. "I live alone." "Don't you have a family?" Lily asked. The room grew slightly heavier. Nathaniel looked into the teacup before him. In the rippling surface of the hot liquid, he saw his own reflection, tired, lonelier than he had ever admitted. "I don't have anyone," he said slowly. "I always thought I didn't need a family." Lily frowned thoughtfully. "But everyone needs a family," she said. "If you don't have one already, you can choose one." Nathaniel looked up. "Choose?" he asked. Lily nodded, as if explaining something obvious. "My mom says there's the family you're born into, and the family you choose. Chosen family are the people who stay with you when you're sad, and don't leave." Elena looked at her daughter, her chest tightening. She never imagined the simple words she once said would echo inside a $1,000,000 penthouse. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. Something shifted quietly inside his chest, enough to make him draw a slow breath. "So, if someone has no one," he asked softly, "how do they know who will stay?" Lily tilted her head. "That's easy," she said. "If someone sees you sad and still wants to sit next to you, that person is family." And that afternoon, in the penthouse that had once known only tense phone calls and thick reports, they sat together, drinking tea, talking about fish, about bedtime stories, and about sorrows that were finally allowed to exist. The calls from the doctor came in rapid succession, leaving him no time left to avoid them. That evening, Nathaniel Cross's black car rolled away from the building in silence. New York glowed under city lights. Reflections from skyscrapers stretched across the car windows in blurred streaks. Nathaniel sat in the back seat, his posture straight, but his hands clasped more tightly than usual. The familiar sense of control was gone. This time, he was not alone. Elena sat beside him, her hands resting on her lap, glancing at him now and then with visible concern. Lily sat close to her mother, clutching her cloth doll tightly, her small feet dangling above the floor. Mrs. Whitmore sat in the front seat, occasionally turning back to ask softly if anyone needed anything. No one spoke much, but the silence inside the car was no longer frightening. When they arrived at the hospital, Nathaniel looked up at the tall white building, one he had entered alone countless times before. But this time, before opening the car door, Lily suddenly reached for his hand. "Don't be scared," she whispered. "Mom and I are here." The simple words tightened Nathaniel's throat. He squeezed her small hand gently and nodded. Inside the consultation room, Dr. Andrew Cole entered with a thick folder. His eyes paused when he saw Nathaniel wasn't alone. "I'm glad you didn't come by yourself," the doctor said. "These conversations shouldn't be faced alone." Nathaniel didn't object. The doctor explained the diagnosis again, slowly, clearly. End-stage heart failure. Medication could buy time. A heart transplant was the only real option, with roughly a 30% chance of success. Elena covered her mouth. Mrs. Whitmore tightened her grip on Nathaniel's hand. The room felt heavy with numbers no one wanted to hear. Only Lily looked up. 30% means there's still a chance, right? She asked. The doctor smiled gently. Yes, it's still a real chance. Nathaniel looked at the little girl. For the first time, that number wasn't just risk or probability. It was hope. Then I'll try, Nathaniel said, his voice low but steady. Not because I'm afraid of dying, but because I want to live. The doctor nodded. As they left the hospital, Nathaniel took a deep breath. The future ahead remained uncertain. The illness was still there. Time was still limited. But this time, he knew one thing for certain. He would not face it alone. That night, Nathaniel Cross's penthouse was no longer swallowed by its familiar silence. Warm, yellow light filled the living room. On the table sat a simple meal Elena had prepared in a hurry. Nothing fancy, nothing luxurious, but full of human warmth. Lily sat on the rug, her cloth doll beside her, drawing pictures and telling small, wandering stories. Mrs. Whitmore stood near the window, quietly smiling. Nathaniel stood there, watching them all. None of them belonged to the world he once considered important. No contracts, no stocks, no power. And yet, he had never felt richer than he did in that moment. He walked to the window and looked down at the glowing city below. New York was still moving endlessly, just as it always had throughout his life. But for the first time, Nathaniel no longer felt the need to chase it. He reached into his jacket pocket. Inside was the folded drawing Lily had given him at the hospital, the picture of their new family. The lines were clumsy, imperfect, yet it was the most valuable thing he had ever owned. For years, Nathaniel Cross believed success required isolation. That strength meant needing no one, that by refusing love, he could avoid pain. He was right, halfway. He avoided pain, but he also never truly lived. Now, facing limited time, Nathaniel understood that what truly frightened people wasn't death. It was leaving this world without ever being genuinely loved. Lily ran over and took his hand. "Uncle Nathaniel," she asked softly, "will you still be here with us tomorrow?" Nathaniel bent down and smiled, a real smile, unforced. "Yes," he said, "tomorrow, and the days after that. I'll try." And in that moment, Nathaniel Cross finally understood a simple truth. There are people who don't need to know who you are. They only need to be there, wipe away your tears, and stay. That is the greatest wealth a person can ever have. 3 months later. That morning, sunlight poured through the large glass windows of the penthouse. But this time, it no longer reflected off cold marble. Instead, it touched very ordinary details. A small towel Lily had forgotten on the sofa, a few unfinished strokes of colored pencil on the table, the faint scent of chamomile tea still lingering in the air. Nathaniel Cross stood by the window, but he was no longer looking at the city as a battlefield to be conquered. He looked down calmly, like a man who finally knew where he stood in his own life. The heart transplant had been successful, not an instant miracle, not an easy road. There were long, exhausting days in the hospital, nights filled with pain and fear. But each morning he woke, the first thing he saw was no longer a stark white ceiling. It was Elena, dozing in the chair beside his bed, and Lily, curled up at the corner of the hospital bed, clutching her old doll. They stayed, every single day. Elena did not speak grand promises. She was simply there, making tea, reading to him, holding his hand when the pain came. She was quiet and patient, just as she had once cleaned every corner of the house, leaving no trace, yet changing the entire space. And Lily. The little girl told him everything about the fish in the tank, silly dreams, stories without beginnings or endings. And every time he was too tired to even open his eyes, that small voice still reached him, steady and sure. "I'm here. Don't be afraid." The day Nathaniel was discharged from the hospital, the sun was gentle. That evening he asked Mrs. Whitmore to prepare dinner. Not a grand affair, no guests, no expensive wine. Just a small table, warm yellow light, and dishes Elena cooked with all her clumsiness and sincerity. After the meal, Nathaniel stood up. He did not speak right away. He simply looked at Elena for a long time, not with the gaze of a powerful man, but with the eyes of someone who had stood before death and returned, with a heart that knew how to love. He stepped forward and knelt down in front of her. Elena froze, her hands instinctively tightening. Lily's eyes went wide, her breath caught. "Nathaniel," she whispered. He took out a ring, not large, not showy, just simple and refined, like the promise he wished to give. "I used to think I didn't need anyone," Nathaniel said, his voice low but steady. "But you and Lily taught me that. Living isn't about controlling everything. Living is having someone to come home to." He looked up, his eyes no longer afraid. "Elena, will you stay by my side? Not as an employee, not out of gratitude, but as family, as my wife." Tears fell from Elena's eyes, not loudly, not dramatically, just the tears of a woman who was finally chosen. She nodded. "Yes, I will." Lily let out a small cry of joy and ran straight toward him. She wrapped her arms tightly around Nathaniel without hesitation, without the fear she had felt the first time she met him. Then, in the clearest and most certain voice in the world, she looked up at him and said, "Dad." The world seemed to stop. Nathaniel froze for a single breath. His heart, the new one, fragile yet real, trembled. He bent down and pulled Lily into his arms, holding her tight, as if afraid that if he let go, the moment would disappear. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'll always be here." Outside, New York remained loud, hurried, endlessly chasing invisible things. But inside the penthouse that had once been cold and empty, a family had been chosen, not by blood, not by money, but by staying, by tears gently wiped away, and by love that arrived at exactly the right time. And that was happiness.